Welcome back, book nerds. This is Library Card, the show for people who want to think deeply about the books they read and get inspired to read more. I'm Megan Gliona. I'm here with Brian Brinkman and RJB. And today we're going to be comparing two stories that, to me, are both about a type of loss. We're going to be discussing The Killers by Ernest Hemingway and A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor. We're going to talk about the stories individually first and then get into their comparisons. So, thinking about The Killers. The Killers is a short story by Ernest Hemingway, which was first published in Scribner's magazine in 1927. It was later republished in Men Without Women, Snows of Kilimanjaro, and the Nick Adams stories. It is set in 1920s in the Prohibition era Summit, Illinois. The story follows a recurring Hemingway character, Nick Adams, as he has a run-in with a pair of hitmen who are seeking to kill a boxer in a local restaurant. The story begins when the hitmen, Max and Al, enter the restaurant, which is called Henry's, and it's staffed by George, the owner, and Sam, the cook. After they order food, Al takes restaurant patron Nick into the kitchen and ties him up and gags him with the cook, Sam. Max talks with George in the front and tells him that they're waiting for an ex-heavyweight prize fighter to come in so they can kill him. After a while, it's clear that the boxer isn't coming, so the hitmen leave to find him. George then sends Nick to the boarding house to warn the boxer. Nick finds the boxer in his room, but the boxer doesn't react and says there's nothing he can do to save him. Nick returns to Henry's to tell George and then decides to leave Summit. This was written during a time when organized crime was at its peak and Al Capone's mob had retreated to Summit, Illinois. Just before the story was written, the Chicago mob had actually ordered the killing of a popular boxer, Andre Anderson. So possibly that was a bit of an inspiration for the story as well. So, Brian, I know you've read a lot of Hemingway. I know you both have. And I'm curious to hear about how this kind of fits in the larger Hemingway in the sense of that this is a reoccurring character for him. And I think this story is pretty popular too and has been written about a lot and talked about a lot. But I'd love to hear kind of how you see this as like indicative of Hemingway or why Hemingway wrote these Nick Adams stories or anything you want to tell us about that and your overall takeaways from the story.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this story uh, condenses a lot of what Hemingway does really well in 4 or 5 pages. And I think that's one of the reasons people go back to it. I think you have a lot of it driven by dialogue alone, and you build a story in that sort of standpoint. You have a lot of big questions about, um, you know, criminal enterprises, defending people, serving people, what you can and can't do when fate is, at your front door, essentially. And a lot of these sort of big ideas Hemingway tends to wrestle with throughout his overall career. Sometimes focusing on hunting in Africa, other times focusing on fishing in the Caribbean, other times focusing on his experience in war. And here, I think it kind of showcases the existential challenges that people have as the world is quickly modernizing in a very small space. And so you get all of these things within 3 to 5 pages here, in a way that feels like a complete story experience, but also, and I think one of the things he loved about jumping in and out of Nick Adams stories is that you could write from this perspective of a young kid evolving in 1920s and 30s America, um, and really showcase a lot about travel, crime, male relationships, good versus evil, grayness, race relations, all this sort of stuff in just a very, very small way that is incredibly efficient. You feel a lot for each of these characters without knowing a ton about their backgrounds and their overall history. And so for all those reasons, like if you are wondering where do I start with Hemingway, this is one of those stories that you ultimately start with.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with all that. The full dialogue story, like we talked about last week, this isn't as much. I guess it's about the same amount in terms of like the ratio. It's crazy. It's crazy to build out a whole story like that. I mean, it's it's like a I think, like you said, Brian, it's like all the stories like take place within, almost a narrow band of potential locations, and they all kind of deal with like the same issues in the same way, which is just sort of interesting because they all feel so different. But yeah, I don't know, Megan, what do you agree with what Brian was saying?
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear that kind of the placement in Hemingway and in his history and what he writes about and the scope of his writing is really helpful because I'm learning a lot about that. To me, this story really felt like almost like a fairy tale in that it's the time that someone's faced with evil for the first time.
Mm,
And there's
mhm.
like a loss of innocence, I think, that really defined the story to me. Nick has this really scary experience and he's totally shocked that the boxer doesn't want to go to the people that are supposed to fix things. He doesn't want to go to the police. And I think it really teaches him something about the darkness of life in that there's not always you can't just go to the good people to get help when you need help, or that
Yeah.
things might be more complicated than that, or um he thinks, I think, also by this act of courage, by it's very brave of him to go and look for this boxer and tell him what's going to happen, and he thinks it's going to like have this big effect, and it doesn't, and that leads to this disillusionment where he's like, I'm going to get out of here, like I can't sit here and watch something horrible happen like this. And I think there's a lot that gets kind of passed down in that story about that with just so little. I mean, this story it's very efficient, like you said, Brian, and it's interesting to me that he can kind of build in what the interiority of Nick without actually ever talking about it directly. I mean, we talked about this a little bit last week, but I'm just fascinated by a writer that can allow you to create meaning and without saying it. It's very in third grade writing, I'm always telling my students like show don't tell. Well, Hemingway is like the epitome of that. He never tells you what someone's thinking or feeling, and it's a real trust of the reader that they're going to get it. And it works so well in this story. I found it really interesting. I thought the other thing that I really took away was this idea of like appearance versus reality.
Mm.
The diner is this like innocent setting, and something really scary happens there, and the hitmen come in and they're supposed to seem scary. They have like dark coats on and gloves and hats, but they're fairly dumb and their plan is like botched, and they're like telegraphing what they're going to do even though they don't need to tell these guys what they're going to do. And so it's this idea of like things might be scary that don't appear to be, and then things that appear to be scary might not be. And that was really interesting to me.
Yeah, I think as a reader, you're like anticipating a plot twist of some kind,
Yeah, I thought the whole time that it was gonna be actually wrote a note in the book, and then I was like, "Well, this isn't true," because I thought that the title of the book was telling us what was happening at the end, like, that they were gonna be killed, like, that these were the killers, and these people were gonna be killed, and so I thought it was one of those titles that, like, tells you the ending, and then when it wasn't, that kinda surprised me.
Well, and I
Yeah.
think that from a structural standpoint, from a form standpoint, I think one of the reasons people go back to this story all the time is that it is living proof that the action doesn't really need to happen. The entire
Mm.
story is this
Mhm.
tension around, are these guys going to kill them? Oh no, they're trying to kill someone else. Is he going to come into the diner? Oh no, he doesn't show. Are they going to find him and Nick's going to find him already killed? No, he's just lying in bed and has like accepted his fate. Like there's so many
Right.
moments within this story where you think the action is about to happen, but the action doesn't come, and you don't need it to come to actually get what he is trying to give out in this story. And like RJ noted, like yeah, this doesn't have as much like string of dialogue the way that Hills Like White Elephants does, where that entire story is guided by it, but there's
Mhm.
enough moments where you're just picking up this pretty consequential conversation between the two hitmen and the guys in the restaurant. But at the end of the day, half of the time they're talking about, you know, what they're going to eat and how long it takes for a sandwich to get made,
Yeah.
and the state of the restaurant. There's a lot of just like innocuous conversation happening in a very tense moment, which I think is probably a pretty accurate thing.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems very realistic. Like people come in and they're like, what the hell? Like, I thought this was a place to get sandwiches. What's wrong with you? It's like kind of happening around the story, which is cool.
It's a really interesting. I mean, one of the things I love about reading him is that it's such a like 1927 was 98 years ago in a lot of cases. Like it wasn't that long ago, but it was also a completely different world. And imagining a place where organized crime has this much of a control that famous athletes are regularly they have hits on them because they are part of
Yeah.
the illegal gambling scheme. Like there's just such a great, you know, peer into a world that is not that far away from us, but is also in a lot of cases a foreign alien type of land.
Yeah, there's a really weird I know I said we weren't going to talk about comps, but I'm breaking my own rule here. There's a really weird comp that I thought about when I was reading the story, and I kept thinking about Pulp Fiction, the
Hmm.
movie,
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
because like there's a diner scene in Pulp Fiction, obviously, but also just this feeling of like there's a menacing darkness to it, but then there's also like a funny humor, kind of bumbling side to it at times, and it
Cohen
just
brothers
was.
too.
Yeah, totally. Like, that would be a Coen Brothers movie, like, scene movie. Yeah, exactly. There's just this feeling of, like, this weird combination of humor and darkness and, um, implied danger, but never always there. Yeah, I thought that was interesting I didn't expect that when I was reading it, and then I was really surprised when I kept thinking about it. It made me wanna watch the movie again.
Yeah. It's a good comp. This was I mean, both these stories, I know we'll get to the second one soon, but just this is a real time and play. These stories don't really age very well in a lot of ways. And I think like I
In
had
terms of the
questions
terms
about
that
that.
they talk about people.
Well,
Yeah.
there's like
Yeah.
very overtly racist stuff, but it's also like there's just something I don't know. There's something so dark about both these stories, and I feel like I've read like so many short stories over the past year or two that, you know, I think we tend to like resolve stories, at,
Mhm.
by instinct, not always, but like, or leaving them open ended is a different way of doing it. But like really darkly ending a story, which both of these do so perfectly. It's just I feel like that's kind of rare these days.
Well, and your point about resolution, I think, is really interesting because so much of modern storytelling, and you really get this in the film industry. It feels like every web has to be tied back up, or every knot has to be,
Yeah.
retied, and every loose end you have to understand what happened. So the conclusion of a movie ends up being like 25 minutes, and part of what makes these stories really appealing is you have no idea what happened to these people, and you don't really need to know. That's not the point. Like this is just like a peer into people in a very traumatic situation within, like you're saying, an era where people were very proper to each other, where people had a way of speaking to each other that when you break that norm, it starts to break all these aspects of society. I think part of that, I'm not advocating for this, but I think part of that is a lot of the racial undertones in these movies, that there is a clear
Hmm.
Yeah.
hierarchy and a clear, authority that you have to respect within society. And if you're outside of that, you don't get respect within the norms of this society. And then when these really dark, traumatic things happen to these people who are reinforcing the hierarchical norms of the society, it seems that much more traumatic because it shouldn't happen to us. We're the ones building society.
Yeah, these stories are so evocative of the time that they're written in. It's really interesting, and I think we should head into the second story now because I
Yeah.
think that
Do
will
it.
that will help. Yeah, we're jumping ahead about 25ish years to "A Good Man Is Hard to Find" by Flannery O'Connor. It was first published in 1953 in the anthology Modern Writing One, and it also appears in her own collection of short stories, "A Good Man Is Hard to Find" and Other Stories, which was published in 1955. This Southern Gothic tale is one of her most well known stories. It's a story of a family heading out on a road trip from Atlanta to Florida. As they're preparing to go, the grandmother wants to go to Tennessee instead because there is an escaped convict called the Misfit heading towards Florida. Bailey, the son, ignores her and packs his family into the car for the long drive. On the drive, the family stops for barbecue, and the grandmother remembers a plantation nearby, and the kids beg them to stop. They turn down a deserted dirt road, and the grandmother realizes she was wrong about the location. When she realizes this, she disturbs the cat she secretly brought along. The cat jumps on the father while he's driving and causes him to lose control of the car. The accident is witnessed by 3 strange men, one of whom turns out to be the misfit, and the family comes to an unfortunate end. So this story kind of shocked me when I was reading it. I did
Yeah.
not expect it to go this way. I've never read any Flannery O'Connor. This is my first. And I understand that she's a Catholic writer, and she is really has written a lot about how she wanted her writing to be read and thought of. And she really believed that people should be pulling the kind of spirituality from her stories. And that was like her biggest, deeper meaning. I also haven't read a lot of kind of Southern Gothic stories, I don't think. And this idea of like focusing on the disturbing elements and it being really setting being really important and the social commentary and the psychological depth, I found it to be really interesting in this story. And I think a perfect example of someone who's able to get you in the minds of people with very little. I think she just does an incredible job of that. RJ, why did you pick this story? And let's hear your takeaways.
Well, I think mostly because it's similar to the Killers in a lot of ways. And I think like we can talk about some of the similarities, but I mean, this is like one of the most well-known short stories ever, you know? And I think it's like partially because it's perfectly constructed. Like you have the cat, you know, that she like sneaks in. And like, first of all, it's like your first takeaway is like, yeah, mother-in-laws are fucking pain in the ass, you know? That's like, but you know, from the bringing the cat to the, you know, realizing that they're not even what the thing that she got the kids super excited about isn't even in the place where they are, which leads to the
Totally.
accident, which leads to her greatest fear coming true. I mean, it's and you know, just how the cat comes back and like the use of the guy, the Bailey wearing the shirt with like the birds on it, you know, there's just like perfect use of metaphor and symbolism in this story that's just like almost impossible to like understate how powerful that all is in the story. You know, this is like it's a perfect story.
Absolutely. I think that the construction of it and the pacing is what really stood out to me. The pacing of the story is like it's pretty breathless, and I think she brings a lot of characters into this story, but you have a very clear sense of who they each are, even if they only
Yeah.
have like a few moments in the story. You absolutely know who works at that barbecue place. You know exactly who they are. You know exactly who those kids are. It's just I think she does an amazing job of characterization in that sense. What stood out to me about this story is that it to me it's about the idea of a loss of faith, and that the misfit has this because he can never so the conversation that he has with the grandmother when spoiler if you haven't read it, you don't want to hear this, but he eventually the misfit kills the whole family, and he kills the grandmother last, and she's begging him and having this conversation with him, and she's talking about God and Jesus and her faith, and you see her kind of wavering in it too, and she has an act of grace for him where he's discussing with her and explaining that he's if he could have been there to see Jesus come back from the dead, then he would believe for real, and then everything would have been different for him. And she puts her hand on his shoulder and says, you're one of us, you're one of God's children too, basically. And it's an act of grace and of faith, and it is so the humanness of it is so intense for him that he shoots her immediately in the chest. And to me, it was like he has had this loss of faith or never had anything to believe in. And so that loss has led him to feel so empty that he's constantly kind of searching for ways to make others feel that or to find something to do that is makes sense to him in a senseless world. But I found the loss of of faith to be the main defining theme of this story, and this idea of grace and how we give each other grace and how powerful grace can be, but ultimately not enough in some
Hmm.
situations too.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me the part of the reason that I like both these stories is that I think the main theme in both of these that I took away anyway is like the inevitability kind of your fate, you know? Like I feel like
Mm.
the grandmother like just sitting there for those however many minutes that was kind of like, you know, she knows like what's going to happen and there's like sort of nothing she can do about it, and it's sort of similar to the boxer who just kind of like, you know, nothing he could do about it. And part of the last line when the misfit says she would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. So like she was like she was like, you know, empathetic and human in the way you're describing, but like, you know, because she knew she was trying to like save her own life. So it was, to me it was sort of like a theme of the inevitability of fate, but also like reminding you that like being how you expect to be is not only when you're trying to like get something from someone or get out of something. It's like when it's always, you know, you should always like
Yeah.
have that same kind of perspective.
Yeah, and it gets to that with a really, like, you're raised thinking you have to respect your elders no matter what. And you see 60 years ago, the same, everybody back in our day was good and kind and proper. And these kids are horrible and they're hitting each other and they're getting bored quickly. And my son is angry and won't, like won't like embrace this vacation either, and is ordering me around, and his wife won't talk to me and she clearly doesn't love me. You get all of this like from
Yeah.
her perspective, as though like these people that she's created are awful, and are not, like, the generational divide is so explicit here, and you would see that again if this story was written 10 years later, just a different setting, and so on and so forth. And like the way that we talk about Gen Z today, and
Totally.
younger generations that like are way too online and technological, and they don't really understand, well, the kids in this story are now in their 70s today. Like, none of that changes.
Yeah.
But to your point, RJ, like, she's kind of like, she doesn't deserve to get murdered on a dirt road. Let's be clear. But like, she's kind of a awful
She's super
person.
annoying. She's
She's
super
Yeah.
real,
annoying.
and O'Connor writes her in such a way that like, you're totally right. Like the pacing, you just can't stop. Like, you're with the entire family, and there's no quiet moments. You're just moving forward on this road trip, which ultimately ends up feeling like, a doomed walk to your death. Like,
Yeah.
feels almost like your last walk. The whole time you just know, as darkness starts to emerge over these characters, that this is not ending in a positive way. And when
No.
they turn down that
No.
road, you're just like, okay, I know where this is going. So she is less of like a human in this story and more of a symbol to me of empathy, and the need for empathy, and the like need to understand that those around you, even if they're young and less experienced, still like their voices ultimately matter. Because just because you're old and you've lived and you've experienced this world, and now you're at a status where you can look at a naked black boy on the streets and be like, oh, that looks like a painting, like,
Oh my
just
God.
because you have this perspective of what is proper doesn't mean that your view on anything is correct, because ultimately she is the one that leads them to their deaths.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how O'Connor paints her as like she speaks in so much cliche. Like
Mm.
she's very constantly saying cliches, and it, to me, kind of indicating that she's like done thinking for herself. Like she never seems to like engage with the people around her in like an authentic way. It's always kind of like speaking in this very cliched way. And some of the other people do too. Like some of the people she meets at the barbecue, they speak in very cliched ways too. Like, oh, you can't trust this guy. The wife is like, of the barbecue guy is like, you can't trust anybody, including you, about her husband and
Yeah.
stuff. And like, there's this very like, there's a lot of that kind of cliched language that just indicates that maybe those people aren't thinking for themselves, when the few moments you get inside the father's head, which isn't very much. This is really the grandmother's story, but you can kind of see that he is thinking for himself, and that he's making his own decisions, and he's not like feeding into that stuff. It's so interesting. The
There,
other thing I wanted to, oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to say one about the grandma. This kind of goes along with what Brian was saying, but there's something at the beginning that she like places in the story so perfectly, where she talks about, the grandmother talks about like being a proper lady and getting dressed for a trip, and says like, in case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady. And that's why she
Yes.
like dressed with like this very proper, but like, you know, foreshadowing or something. Like it's not, it's just so perfect that like it, when it comes back later, you're just like, wow, that was like an amazing little detail that also shows what, like a theme that Brian was discussing, you know, and it wasn't just like
Yeah.
placed there to like move the plot forward.
My God, the imagery too of her when how she explains how she's crumpled with her legs crossed like a child looking up at the sky when she's dead. That imagery is incredible. Like
It's crazy.
she's really evocative in her setting. It's pretty incredible. I wanted to ask you both about the title and why you think it's called A Good Man Is Hard to Find. My thinking was that it's the grandmother's voice.
Yeah.
Right. And she's kind of saying like, you know, the whole time she's complaining about everyone. And I think she probably feels that way about her son, about her grandson, about this misfit and these other men with her. And I think kind of echoed in the language of the wife of the barbecue owner as well. And this idea of like judgment and societal expectations. But I wanted to hear what you thought about it.
I mean, my take was like, you know, which they use the title in the context of the barbecue owner saying like everything's getting terrible.
Yeah.
I feel like in both these stories, it's sort of like the first time that the character or a main character is like faced with real evil, and that's like a similarity between these two. I mean, this one is much more dark, I think, than The Killers, but it's a similar thing, right? They like see this for the first time and are like, oh wow, this is like really horrible and real. I feel like that is the title. It's like, you know, there are very like truly bad people out there, and like no matter what you do, you can't really change them or say anything to dissuade them or whatever it is. So that was my take on it. But curious what you guys think.
I mean, I agree with everything you guys have said. I would think I would add it to me is the danger of nostalgia and like a society at large that is um, immersed in and obsessed with nostalgia and this idea that life in the past was somehow better. You read any history and you realize that like a things have been pretty awful for a long time with spurts of improvement from a technological, sociological extension of rights, so on and so forth. But that, like, at every stage, there's huge risks, huge dangers, huge challenges that people deal with. And this, like, idea that we get obsessed with from a larger societal standpoint that if we could just go back to this period, everything would be better. And you're like, the irony here is that the misfit almost like speaks like a proper man. Like he still has been like educated to a degree. He still knows how to like speak in the, you know, about God on a very deep level. He's clearly been schooled in some way and life just went wrong for him. There's no rhyme or reason to it. He's, you know, he's a bit younger than she is. But like he is still he's still a part of this society that has ultimately gone wrong. It's not that if we had, you know, went back to the world that the grandmother wanted, this risk would not be awarded. It would just be it would be coming from a different source.
Yeah, I like that idea of nostalgia. Is there anything similarities or differences that we haven't talked about that you want to talk about before we wrap up?
I just want to kind of combine what Brian was saying about the first story with this one, which is that the killing doesn't happen in the story. It happens like off screen, you know, which I think is like really interesting that it's like, I mean, you know, what's happening. It makes it even like worse that it's that,
Totally.
you know, it's not like in front of the grandma. Like it's just, it makes it so much darker, I think. So I think that's like, and similar to The
It's like in a
Killers, you don't
movie.
know.
Yeah, it's like in a movie when I think like Zone of Interest, which is a movie I talk about a lot, but how you never see what's going on in the concentration camp, you just hear it and it's all implied and it is for some reason even more evocative. And I think that when you can do that as an artist, that's just absolutely, I think it's really powerful. You know, I hate movies that just like show you everything and don't allow you to create some of the meaning too. So yeah, I think that's a really good point.
I agree with those. The only thing I would say to kind of bring it back to earth on a similarity standpoint, amazing depictions of roadside diners. Like what a
Yeah.
setting, you
Yeah.
know, and like just you get
Totally.
into like the nuances of like what is available on the menu and how everything is wrapped and like I don't know. I was pretty starving while reading both of these books in a good way.
That's awesome. Great
So
call.
great. So true. Yeah, I love that.
Can I keep picking 2 stories, guys? To be
Yeah,
I
this
think
is
it's a
so
great
test?
I think it's a great
fun.
approach.
You passed the test. I appreciate it.
Yes.
And next week, we're actually talking about a story and a movie. So we have to figure out how we're going to do that. I think we're back in 2 weeks for that. I guess Brian and I are going to have to figure out how we're going to set this up because we're going to be talking about A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. And then we're going to be talking about After Hours, the film. So I'm
Great.
pretty excited for that
I'm ready.
conversation.
Am I
Combo
invited? Can I
hosting.
come to that one?
Please, come on. Are you kidding me? I need to hear your
We're
after
not
hours
doing
thoughts.
it without you. We're not doing
I
it
love
without
that.
you.
After Hours is great.
Absolutely. So great. All right, great. Well, we'll see you in a few weeks then. And we'll be getting into some Scorsese and some Hemingway. Should be fun. Until then, happy reading, everyone.